Hey there, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Delighted to be joined by Nick Estes. He is a member of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. He is host of the Red Nation podcast, also author of a great book that I read. It is called Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. I wanted to have you on. We'll talk about a bunch of stuff, but I wanted to talk about Leonard Peltier, who at this point is the longest serving political prisoner that I know of in America, particularly Native American prisoner. He has been in jail almost 50 years for a crime that even prosecutors who prosecuted him now state there's no actual evidence he committed, and that is the murder of two FBI agents during a shootout in the 1970s at the Pine Ridge Reservation. And recently, he was up for parole. This is probably fourth or fifth opportunity. And even though he is 79 in poor health, he was denied again parole. And just to update people, within the last few days, he was recently hospitalized. He was released from a 4-day hospital stay on Monday, July 16th. The elder's diabetes caused him to develop open wounds and tissue death on his toes and feet. We don't exactly know the exact diagnosis, but needless to say, between that, he's had COVID in prison a couple times. He is likely not to live forever. First, your reaction. It kind of got lost because it's just chaos in the news among the genocide, 2024. But I assume you're not super surprised. But what was your reaction to Leonard Peltier again remaining in prison?
This is just another death sentence on the part of the Bureau of Prisons and the justice system in the United States for another, indigenous elder. Leonard Peltier survived the genocidal boarding school system. His whole life has been defined by sort of incarceration in many ways. So this isn't surprising, but it's also a stain on the justice system, as well as every presidential administration in which he has been, imprisoned. And it's important to remind people that Leonard Peltier's co-defendants, Bob Robidoux and Dino Butler, were, acquitted of the same charges that Leonard Peltier was convicted of for reasons of self-defense, right? The prosecution has never been able to place Leonard Peltier at the site, of the shooting of the FBI agents in 1975. Their theory of the case kind of fell apart in the 80s in an appeals process. And eventually they kind of concluded that, Leonard Peltier was perhaps not directly responsible for shooting these FBI agents, but nonetheless was aiding and abetting those who did. So if his co-defendants were acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, then who was he aiding and abetting? And at that time, the prosecution said, well, maybe he was aiding and abetting himself. And I don't know if that was a joke, a sarcastic sort of aside, or just an admission of defeat, because it's not a crime, first of all, to aid and abet self-defense. And second of all, how can you aid and abet yourself when you didn't, when you haven't been found guilty of committing that particular murder? So it's a sham, up and down, has been for the last several decades. There's some other recent developments, if you want to talk about those that have happened. His parole hearing, the parole decision came down on July 2nd. His sort of last remaining option in this moment. They're appealing that particular decision, and it might be several years before he actually gets another parole hearing. And I think he's actually up again when he's like somewhere in his 90s. He'll be eligible for parole, but given the medical situation that you just detailed earlier, he is at the end, years of his life. And if he has any final options, it remains with a man who is similar in age to him, and that's President Biden. And if we are going to be realistic about this election, And the way that things are playing out, it's really looking that Biden, the chances are increasing that Biden is not going to be the president again of the United States. We can only speculate at this point about what's going to happen. But just given the current, situation, political situation with this election cycle, things are really up in the air. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so outgoing presidents tend to grant clemency at the end of their term, like in December. So we're looking at a short time frame the next several months where his clemency application will be reviewed. A decision probably will come down at the end of this year. And so there's, it's all hands on deck in that sense, because it's up to Biden's administration to grant clemency. He's been denied clemency from Trump on, in all previous sort of presidential administrations. So that's where the case is right now. I don't know if folks have been following the news. There's been some more surprises and twists and turns that I can get into if you want to talk about them, in terms of his supporters, his longtime supporters withdrawing support for a variety of reasons that I think are relevant to this particular parole hearing and case.
Sure. Yeah. Talk about withdrawing support and the reasons.
Sure. So the Assembly of First Nations recently this week rescinded its support while, Leonard Peltier was in the hospital. The prison hospital. They cited reasons, first of all, it's important to point out why they supported his case in the first place. And Leonard Peltier was extradited from Canada to the United States to stand trial based on coerced and falsified witness testimony, specifically arising from an individual named Myrtle Pourbaix, who later recanted her testimony, saying that she had witnessed Leonard Peltier kill these agents and that she was also the girlfriend of Leonard Peltier, and she had never actually met him until his Fargo trials that happened. So the basis of his extradition from Canada to the United States has always been questioned, and also the fact that he was holed up in a reserve in the north and being protected by First Nations peoples. This has always been sort of a reason why the Assembly of First Nations has strongly and vehemently supported, overturning at least the extradition that, brought him back to the United States. So in this article that came out of CBC in Canada, the Assembly of First Nations reversed the 37-year support for Leonard Peltier based on his alleged role in interrogating the murdered activists of Anime Pictou Akwash. And this is worth actually addressing, because this is something that Leonard Peltier has been accused of doing, and according to all accounts, including Leonard Peltier himself, this didn't happen the way that the FBI, the way that the narrative is being put out there to the public. And there's been a decades-long smear campaign and misinformation campaign that I think is worth talking about in this particular moment, because it shows the depths to which not only the FBI, but also local law enforcement in states like South Dakota go to keep not only Leonard Peltier in prison, but to also lock up and to bury this really important pivotal history of the Red Power movement and tribal, for tribal sovereignty. So this case, this accusation stems from a 1975 meeting in Farmington, New Mexico, an AIM meeting. There was a brutal slaying of several Navajo men on the streets. AIM decided to hold its convention down there. According to the prosecutors' theories of the case, this is a time period in which Anime Akwash was suspected of being an FBI informant by some individuals within AIM. That didn't include Leonard Peltier. That didn't include Leonard Peltier's future co-defendants, Dino Butler and Bob Robidoux, who had formed this kind of Northwest AIM chapter, or were part of this Northwest AIM chapter. So when they were asked to question Anime Akwash about this accusation, they did it as friends, and it wasn't a confrontational thing. And in fact, they took Anime Akwash under their own protection, and to protect her from these accusations that were coming from these other individuals. So this accusation that somehow she had been part of this, or he had been part of this murder, or this conspiracy to murder her, is inaccurate. And in fact, when Anime Akwash was killed in December of 1975, according to the FBI's own documents, own FBI reports. And I'll get into this a little bit later. Leonard Peltier had fled to Canada, and he was not in communication. There was no way that he could have communicated with anyone. He couldn't get a phone call. He couldn't do anything. It was just, so hot. He was on, he was on the run. So there was no way that he could have physically been able to either order some kind of hit or to facilitate the murder himself. And in fact, the people that he was with, Ramona Peterson, who was part of this Northwest kind of Fissions movement in the Northwest, actually helped him cross the border and has come out. She's in her 90s. And she's been to a lot of these rallies. She's a Native elder, very highly revered for her role in the Fission struggles in the 1960s and 1970s. She was at the last rally they held in Washington, D.C., and has told her story over and over again that she was the one who helped, who brought Leonard Peltier to the Canadian border. There's no way that he could have done the things that the FBI or all these other people are accusing him of doing, because she was with him the entire time. And she's gone on record saying this multiple times. The other kind of question, the big question to a lot of us who have been a part of not only the Leonard Peltier clemency campaign, but also those of us who have studied this history in detail, is why is it that the FBI knew that Anime Aquash was murdered in 1975, but didn't open an investigation in terms of charging people with that murder until the 90s? And what, because according to their own reports, based on the informants that they had sort of embedded within the Denver community, where she fled after she absconded from her hearing that she was supposed to have in Pierre, South Dakota. She was arrested, when she was with Leonard Peltier in a mobile home in Oregon at that time. So she had basically, was with Leonard Peltier at that time, but then was arrested, extradited to South Dakota, and then skipped her bail and then fled to Denver, where she was, according to the FBI's theory of the case, where she was kidnapped and then brought back to South Dakota and executed. Well, the big question for me in all of this is, while this narrative is out there that she was killed because of whatever knowledge that Leonard Peltier allegedly imparted to her about his role in the killing of the FBI agents, like, why wasn't her murder investigated from the get-go? And in fact, her body was found in February of 1976. So just to kind of give people some timelines here, because this is a lot of information. It's very confusing. So Anime Aquash's body was found on a corner of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in February 1976. She was not identified until days later or weeks later in March. And this was at the request of her family and her attorneys and AIM attorneys to disinter her body and to do an autopsy, but also to identify the body. Her body was again buried on March 2nd, 1976, and then her hands were removed by the FBI and sent to an FBI lab in March 1976. In March, disinterring her body, and then another autopsy found weeks later that it was in fact a fatal bullet that had killed her. This was missed by the first autopsy, where they literally said that she was just a victim of exposure. Just another drunk, dead Indian on the reservation, no investigation. But what was really strange about the initial crime scene of where she was found is that you had FBI agents on scene, as well as Bureau of Indian Affairs police officers on scene. If it was just another drunk Indian and they didn't know who she was at that time, why was there these FBI agents on scene doing this investigation? And why did it take so long, for them to identify the body, and also to identify the proper, reasons for death. So, in in a sort of a cache of released FBI documents, an April 1976 teletype from the FBI related sort of additional information, right? So this is a month after she had been identified, saying that the Denver FBI field office hadn't, verified sort of the validity of this information, but nonetheless, they had identified on December 19th, 1975, an informant had told them that Anime Aquash had been murdered. And this is within a week of the time frame that the FBI and the state's theory of the case places her murder somewhere around December 11th, December 12th, 1975. That's pretty key information, if you ask me. And why wasn't it investigated then? And so fast forward into the early 2000s, you have several trials of her accused murderers underway, although Looking Cloud was charged and convicted and sentenced for involvement into her murder. There was Thelma Rios in Rapid City. She was, she pleaded out for her involvement in this murder. And then also John Graham, who was extradited from Canada to the United States, and also charged, convicted, and sentenced of her murder. Initially, he was supposed to stand trial in a federal court, but for whatever reason, they switched it to a state court. His original extradition from Canada to the United States said he would stand trial in federal court. He ended up standing trial in state court. They're appealing that decision right now. So that's the status of it. And there's also one other individual who was named in that murder case that never stood trial, was never charged with the murder, and her name is Theda Nelson. So these are all some big questions that a lot of us have in relation to why Leonard Peltier to this day is still being accused of something that he was physically unable to commit. And if they had the evidence to charge him with this murder, why haven't they charged him with this murder? Because they're so intent on keeping him in prison anyways for a different set of murders. Like, why wouldn't it, unfold in that manner? That's a big question that a lot of us have. But also, why is it that the FBI sat on this evidence that it knew in December of 1975 for almost 30 years before it formally charged anyone with her murder? And so to me, it seems like there's more this raises more questions than it has definitive answers, but also it's raising series of doubts in people's minds in the lead up to a clemency, granting of clemency in December, and the months leading up to this really important decision, and also the fact that it just happened right after he was denied parole this month, that this information comes out, again, tarnishing him and tying him to something that he had said that he has not had an involvement with, and simply the facts do not add up in this particular case. And we should be asking and demanding a justice for Anime Aquash. But I think the questions need to be asked of the FBI of why is it that you sat on this information for 30 years? But then also you could clear his name if you wanted to by releasing these documents and releasing the proper information. But instead, the rumor mill is festering, and it's resulting in a death sentence for a Native elder.
And, just looking at, pretty cut and dry facts for people that don't know, during his trial back in the 70s, the prosecution could not provide any witnesses that had seen him supposedly shoot at these FBI agents. And a couple of years ago, one of the lead prosecutors wrote a letter to President Obama. One of the lead prosecutors who was responsible for convicting him wrote a letter to President Obama requesting clemency, which is kind of unheard of for a prosecutor who was part of, most prosecutors will go down to their deaths that they got it right. He requested clemency, not to mention, as Peltier's lawyers have issued on appeal, the FBI withheld ballistics from the defense regarding that the bullets, they couldn't prove that it came from his gun. So there's so much evidence that at least the prosecutors had, been unethical, that normally would result in a mistrial or something like that going free. But for white folks who I do believe should have been released, Obama released Edward Snowden, which they claimed he was a villain, an evil, and put people's lives at risk. They just released Julian Assange. I agree with that, but they claim he, got people killed by releasing sources and identities. So it seems that they've allowed shortened sentences or releases of political prisoners that are white. Why do you think the FBI is so hell-bent, particularly on Leonard Peltier? Because that does affect whether Obama or Trump or Biden do a pardon or do clemency. We know that they are very, very in tune with what their military industrial complex apparatus feels.
I mean, that's a really great question. We can only speculate, but we can also look at FBI agents who have committed murder. So, for example, I can't remember the name, but they made a movie about it. This FBI agent who impregnated his informant and then subsequently murdered her and drove around with her body in his trunk. This man is out. He's living as a free man right now. He served his sentence. I think it was under 10 years. You can also look at the histories of people like Whitey Bulger. So when we think of the FBI, there's this tendency to say all these bad things happen under J. Edgar Hoover. And the FBI has been in the past, half century trying to reform itself and moving away from this, this Hoover, the figure of Hoover, the shadow of Hoover, and the awful things he did under COINTELPRO, the persecution, the political persecution of progressive movements in the United States, etc. But, Whitey Bulger was an FBI informant for multiple, under multiple directors of the FBI, and has killed dozens of, is responsible and has admitted to, the killing of, or been tied to the killing of dozens of people, right? There's also, Greg Scarpa Sr., who was recruited as a top echelon criminal in the top echelon criminal informants, and they all continued killing people as FBI informants, right? So this question about, it's not just about it is about race, but it's also about how the FBI has also gotten away with murder in many of these cases, or turned a blind eye when its own informants and its own agents were committing, crimes.
Let's add the CIA into that too while we're at it.
Yeah, I mean, the list goes on and on. So if we even hold Leonard Peltier to the standard that the FBI has held its own FBI agents who've committed murder, going back to this one who killed his own informant, Leonard Peltier has served more than twice, almost 4 times the sentences that this individual has, if Leonard Peltier even committed these murders, which he has maintained his innocence, from day one. So,
and that's also important because he could have at some point struck a deal. I mean, he would have served time, but at this point, if he would have, let's just say he is innocent, but just to not be in prison the rest of his life, he could have admitted guilt and got out by this point, we would assume, but he has refused to, which goes to tell you he's not going to say he's guilty for something he did not do. Exactly.
And these parole board hearings actually emphasize remorse for crimes, but also they're very much put into the hands of law enforcement. So it's whether or not law enforcement determines this person is eligible, won't be a threat. It's not really based on his case. It's not like the regular kind of, court of law. It's different. It's completely, it's a it's a remnant of a bygone era, right? So parole hearing, this, he falls under, I can't remember the exact categorization, but he falls under the set of old prisoners parole hearing thing, so it's an archaic mode. And I think in many ways it's kept in place to specifically punish political prisoners of this particular era, those who, were involved in movements like the American Indian movement or other, progressive social movements at that particular time. And so I think in many ways, when you add in that political element, these crimes in the eyes of the FBI become that much greater, right? And it shows you that this isn't about criminal justice. This is about political persecution, period. Like, otherwise, why focus on, like, why spend so much time, energy, and resources for the last 5 decades in keeping this man in prison? It was the only time the FBI ever marched publicly or did a public demonstration was back in the 90s, when Bill Clinton gestured towards considering releasing Leonard Peltier or considering his case. He didn't even say he would. He just said he would consider it. This enraged and incensed the FBI that they marched on Washington or in front of the White House in protest. Like, this is the level of investment here is pretty astounding if you think about it. But it also lends itself to this larger narrative that kind of demystifies the FBI as, some kind of law enforcement agency that's only looking at criminal acts, because it's actually investigating political organizations and political organizing in this country. Nothing says that better than the way that the FBI was recently revealed by reporting by my friend Aileen Brown, their role in the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle. We know about the corporate sort of informants and infiltrators. There was a recent civil case in the state of North Dakota around law enforcement, where several, or at least one FBI agent was on the witness stand and said that they had cultivated between 1 to 10 informants operating at one particular time, or at any particular time in the camps in the late 2000, I think from August to December of 2016. So that's a pretty bold admission. But also, the FBI agent in this particular witness testimony also said that, quote, they were performing paramilitary, that's the word he uses, paramilitary function in supporting other law enforcement agencies. Right. He was talking specifically about drone surveillance. Well, where does that word paramilitary come from in the history of the FBI? The FBI first admits that it reformed itself or reorganized itself for a paramilitary function in Indian country in a memo in April of 1975, just months before the shootout at the Jumping Bill property on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So it was looking back at the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973 and said, because of the special jurisdictional issues that exist on Indian reservations, the state of South Dakota can't deploy the National Guard. We don't want to create a media spectacle around deploying the 82nd Airborne, which was actually considered at that time, but we will use a general. His name was Volney Warner, to essentially operate as the supply chief, but also he was giving expert sort of advice to law enforcement on how to use certain military equipment that they were getting from the the Defense Department, which included APCs, M16s, grenade launchers to shoot, tear gas canisters, sniper rifles, flyovers, all those kinds of things. But the FBI prior to that was just kind of like a suit and tie investigation, unit that would develop and cultivate informants. That was kind of their, they would develop and cultivate intelligence, right? When they assassinated Fred Hampton, for example, that wasn't the FBI. That was a sheriff's deputies unit that did that. The FBI wasn't really having shootouts with political organizations at that time. So when Wounded Knee happened, they were forced into a position to develop a paramilitary response. That's their words, not mine, to the situation of the American Indian movement on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So it's so fascinating that this has come full circle now.
Right.
From 1973, 1975, and the reign of terror, the dozens of victims of murder, of beatings, and violence on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation as a result of the crackdown on the American Indian movement. Any perceived sympathies, real or imagined, that one may have, put a target on your back. So that's why Leonard Peltier was there in 1975. It was to protect the people of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation from this crackdown by both the FBI and these vigilante organizations known as the Goon Squad. And we don't have the same kind of investigations, of these murders, of these beatings that we do. We don't have that same kind of resource and manpower that exists, for keeping Leonard Peltier in prison. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it they're so interested in keeping, and targeting, Leonard Peltier and smearing him and keeping him in prison, but never returning to the scene of the crime of all these other, outstanding cases. And so this is a big question. And then also to see the continued usage of this word paramilitary in its surveillance and policing of indigenous, protest movements today.
I want to ask you broader. You're hearing all the, political and media hysteria about quote unquote democracy is at stake. And I don't want to minimize it. I mean, if you listen to Trump's speech last night, it was pretty dark. And obviously, Project 2025 and what these folks want to do is pretty dangerous. However, it kind of rings hollow to me hearing about the creeping threat of fascism, because everything we're talking about to me is fascism. I mean, when I was at Standing Rock reporting, I'm like, this is fascism. Literally, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Marshals were sharing intel reports with a private contractor working for an oil company. I mean, that's the merger of the corporate state and the government, which is a form of fascism. I'd love to know your thoughts, because it seems to me they're keeping a political, basically, they're keeping Leonard Peltier in prison, I believe, because they don't want to admit they got it wrong. And based on what you're talking about with the sharing of intelligence, the drones, we're seeing, I believe, a lot of fascism from the military apparatus and the politicians, including those in the Democratic Party, when it comes to Leonard Peltier, Standing Rock, and continued attacks on precious resources at reservations.
I interviewed a retired FBI agent, Colleen Rowley, specifically about her support of Leonard Peltier's clemency. She wrote a letter to President Biden several years ago, and she made this interesting point. FBI Director Chris Wray invokes the FBI family. He invoked it, back then. He invoked it today, or this month, when or last month, I should say, when they had the parole hearing, and saying, that the FBI family is totally against, and it's this mafia kind of reference, right? And it shows you that this is an FBI family vendetta. That's what Colleen Rowley calls it, an FBI family vendetta. That is not, there's nothing democratic about that. This is just pure revenge at this point. We can look back just in the last year at the immense, not just levels of police surveillance, but the levels of surveillance in general, social and cultural surveillance around the question of Palestine. I can speak as an academic, as somebody who works at a university, where I was, a congressman in New Jersey said that I should be banned from campus. There were legislators at the University of Minnesota, legislators in Minnesota, Republican legislators that were calling for the defunding of departments, who were speaking out on the issue of Palestine, or even teaching it in their courses, right? So there was the crackdown on the students across college campuses. We're going to find out in the probably decades to come, all the levels of infiltration that has existed, the ruining of people's lives, through these investigations, the paranoia it creates amongst, activists and communities about, whether or not somebody is an informant. We saw in the George Floyd summer, there's a great podcast called The Alphabet Men, where they reveal this, Denver FBI informant who entrapped individuals, getting them to purchase guns. So yeah, like in many ways, like these things have not only, like, we look back at this era of like COINTELPRO and, the American Indian movement, and we think about like, this was an incredibly violent era, but in some ways, as you said, like the merger between corporations and the security arm of the state, the men with guns essentially, hasn't been, more complete in many ways. Like even looking at how there was a fund created by Enbridge here in Minnesota when they're building the Line 3 pipeline to essentially pay the overtime of police officers who were policing that. And you
Right.
can't say that there's not a conflict of interest there. There's a profit motive incentive there, and so I think in some ways we're also seeing, I think with this recent assassination attempt, we're going to see a crackdown again. Instead of asking like, we see like these massive, school shootings that happen in Uvalde. We're saying like, wow, police don't actually protect us, right? So what's the function of the police? We should be asking these critical questions. So they're not even protecting, a presidential candidate. In many ways, there's so many security failures. They give off this image that they're this, strong, sturdy, competent. But in reality, it's like they're really good at oppressing poor people. We saw that happen here in George Floyd. They're really, with George Floyd and the uprisings that happened with that, and all the investigations around the police department and its role in policing children. Essentially, that's what they were. They're brutalizing children, not just grown men like George Floyd. They found that these police officers who were adjacent to and colleagues with Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd, were primarily targeting Black and Native youth in this city, right? So we have to ask ourselves, like, there's people kind of like, I guess, chafe at the notion of defunding the police, but they've never asked what is the function of the police. They can't even, if anything, conservatives should be looking at like, well, they can't even protect the president, like a presidential candidate. They can't protect schools. There's no place that's safe, right, from vigilante violence, and there's no place safe from state violence. So what kind of country and what kind of future is that for people? And this case in particular with Leonard Peltier just blows the doors wide open on that, because it's like, it also makes you ask, what is the point of punishment? What is the point of a prison? Essentially it's a death sentence for this individual. And at some point, when is it a form of torture? When this person is being denied medical care, but then also being exposed over and over again. I mean, you know this better than anybody now, to the dangers and the risks of COVID and other communicable diseases.
Yeah. And my last question, I mean, not that you could speak for all of, Indian country, but what would it mean to Native Americans if he were released, which at this point seems unlikely because his next parole, he'd be in his 90s in 15 years. But what would it mean? Because it seems to me in my experience at Standing Rock and elsewhere, obviously, most Native Americans don't have a warm feeling about the United States government, but it just seems to me it keeps people in hopelessness when such a revered figure is kept in this torture. Whereas maybe it would give a little hope, some type of semblance of justice if he were released. What would it mean to Native Americans if Leonard Peltier were released?
I've been involved in this campaign for more than a decade now. And I can tell you from personal experience that it's the grassroots people that keep this campaign alive and that keep the hope of Leonard Peltier getting out of prison alive. I can say that with absolute utter certainty. Going to Oglala, going to the Jumping Bull property, talking with individuals and listening to their stories. They are the people who, like, I'm an academic, I have a platform, I try to use that responsibly, but these are really the true voice of this movement and the power behind it, right? It's not people like me with big platforms. It's really the everyday Native people on reservations who understand that this system is rigged against them. Leonard Peltier is just proof of that this system is rigged against him. And we talk about, I read a lot about these histories of people literally sacrificing their lives for change. And we see incremental change, and think about even Leonard Peltier being imprisoned. But before he was even imprisoned, the question of the federal Indian boarding school system was not even touched. It was never something that was available in a common language. Under the directorship of Deb Haaland, the Department of Interior, the first Native woman to be director of that, she led the first investigation in 2022, like in the year of our Lord. After like these things, the system had eventually been closed, had been closed down for several years. I mean, it's still functioning in many ways, but they're just now acknowledging this, right? So think about that sort of like the things that people were fighting about at that particular moment in time. They're just now sort of incrementally acknowledging the horrors and admitting to the horrors that existed, right? We all know I didn't need Deb Haaland to come and say that this was happening. My family didn't need to say that this was happening, who are boarding school survivors. They all knew it. They all lived it. But it's the truth that's in prison with him, right? Mm. That's what they're afraid of the most. And I think this demonstrates that the true history, the true reckoning that needs to happen in this land will only happen once he's released from prison. And it's not to place all this on an individual, right? Leonard Peltier I've talked to him on the phone. He's like my uncle. He's like my grandpa. He's got many faults. He's a human being. And I think it would be wrong to say that he's anything but a human being, right? But it's not him. It's the people that he represents that are in prison with him that is important. So I think that's what we all see in, Leonard Peltier. And when you do talk to him, it's like, yeah, what threat does he really pose? He's literally being, hospitalized because he's in such bad health. And so it's not just a death sentence for him. It's also, a form of torture to not only us as a larger community, but also to his family. I was in the hotel room when his son died in Washington, D.C. He passed away in December of 2016 when we were asking Democrats, Republicans to meet with us to consider, the Leonard Peltier case. He died trying to get his dad out of prison. He was alive until his death. He was born the year his dad was incarcerated. So he's never known anything but his dad being in prison. And he died fighting for his freedom. And if there's any sort of, greater injustice, that could be perpetrated, it's this collective punishment by incarcerating this Native elder and holding him and torturing his family, and by default torturing the rest of his community. And it's such a stain. And if I don't have a lot of faith in the Democratic Party. I don't have a lot of faith in Biden. He's responsible for arming a genocidal state right now, and it's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. But if we can get one thing out of this, it would be the release of Leonard Peltier.
Thank you for taking the time. Everybody should listen to Nick, Red Nation podcast, and I loved your book, which is called "Our History is the Future: Standing Rock First is the Dakota Access Pipeline. Thanks, and hopefully we'll be able to talk one day when he's released.
Just a note too, there's a new version of the book out in paperback by Haymarket Books. Check it out. There's a new afterword kind of reflecting on Standing Rock, and the publication of this book. So if you want to check it out, please do. It's at haymarketbooks.com.